Hello, everyone. I wanted to look over the review questions for the second module of our course, which is Hans Jonas's The Burden and Blessing of Mortality and Glenn Gray's The Idea of Death and Existentialism. Let's take a look at the Jonas questions. Number one, in what sense does Jonas think that mortality is a burden in one sense? In what sense a blessing? The important thing I think to see there, one of the reasons I ask you a question, is because he does make this distinction right away between the two basic senses of mortality. It's right here. Two meanings merge in the term mortal. That the creature, so-called, can die, is exposed to the constant possibility of death, and that eventually it must die. It is destined for the ultimate necessity of death. That to understand the burden and blessing idea, you have to understand these two fundamental different senses of being mortal. And those are the can die and the must die. The can die is the idea that we can die at any moment, that death is a perpetual possibility for a living organism. Whereas the must die is to do with the ultimate inevitability of death, that we don't know when we'll die, but we know that we will. So it's that basic distinction which is really important, and actually I would say important for a lot of what will come in the course, that distinction between the can die, the perpetual possibility of death, and the must die or will die, the ultimate inevitability of death. And of course, Jonas thinks that the first sense is the burden, the can die, whereas he argues later in the paper that the second sense is the blessing, the must die. Number two, how does the, oh, I messed that up, sorry. Just pause for a second. I'm still here. I'm sorry. I'm waiting for the page to load. Thank you. Sorry about that. Number two, how does the ontology of organisms differ from that of other things? Remember, he explains himself. The word ontology, which is a philosophy word, means the study of being. And the ontology of an organism would be its manner of being. It's a thing. It's an existent thing, but its way of existing is unique, he thinks. And it differs from that of other things. If we think of other things as being non-living things, inanimate objects, their manner of being is different. And the unique thing about the organism is that its being is its own doing, as he says. That is, that it can only continue to exist by continuing to be active and do something. Whereas an inanimate object just has to sort of sit there. It doesn't have to make any sort of effort. And that really leads into number three. In what sense is the being of an organism a task? Well, the being of an organism is an effort. It's a task. It's a job. Being an inanimate object is not a job. Right? Just being a non-sentient thing, as Jonas says, it will continue to exist as long as something else doesn't come along to destroy it. Whereas an organism has to continually work, be active. And he mentions metabolism in this regard as being the constant activity that an organism has to engage in just to continue to be what it is, of course, which is an avoidance of death. So there's the burden, that is that organisms, not just human beings, but all living things, have to constantly reaffirm their being in the face of death as a way of avoiding death. You can think of the activity of the being. And here he means the basic organic activity, really the unconscious activity of metabolism as being a constant pushing away of death in order to maintain itself. Number 4, do you agree with Jonas's conclusion that our mortality can be viewed as a blessing? Why or why not? Obviously, this is an open-ended question. The important thing is to start thinking about what his reasons are for saying that the inevitability of death, the must die or can die, or not the can die, the must die or will die, as opposed to the can die, is a blessing. And I don't need to review those arguments, but that's what I mean you to do there. I will only say that, roughly speaking, there's the sort of social, civilizational argument that we need death to happen. And then there is the individual argument that even on the individual level, no one would want to live forever, even if civilization kept on progressing. So the important thing is to look at what those reasons are. I won't review them here. They're easily found and not very, they're pretty clear reasons. So let's look at the gray questions. It would be nice if they would come up. Maybe not. Sorry, I'll just have to find them. Okay, number 1, according to Gray, why has modern philosophy pretty much ignored the subject of death? This is something that he deals with in the beginning of the essay. It may not be all that important, really, in the grand scheme of things for us, but it really has to do with the history of philosophy and certain metaphysical view, which is a view about the basic structure of reality. If you are a philosopher who believes that whatever is can never not be, which some philosophers certainly did believe, and probably still do, that is that once something is, it cannot become nothing, then death is really an illusion, right? Death is really not real. If being is indestructible, all being, then the fear of the nothingness of death is unwarranted. So if you believe that, as many philosophers, Gray claims, have believed through the centuries, then death is just not such a big deal. And so it's not something that philosophers have spent a lot of time thinking about in the history of philosophy. Number 2, what does it mean to say that we are chiefly creatures of comfort, not seekers of truth? And what are the implications of this for our consciousness of death? That is a very striking thing that he says on page 117, and it really has to do with the existentialist view of death as being nothingness. That is, existentialism in its classical form, I take to be a kind of an atheism. I know that there are Christian existentialists, but I don't think that that's really classic existentialism. If you look down here on page 116, he quotes Heidegger, to exist as a human being means to be exposed to nothingness. It means I would say in Hans Jonas's terminology, to constantly be exposed to death, or that the can die is built into being a human being. So it's a constant possibility, yet we human beings are, he says, are creatures of comfort. That is, this is a terrifying possibility for us. This is a terrifying idea, so we avoid it. And that's a really important part, I think, of the existentialist message, is that our consciousness of death is something that is constantly being denied, being suppressed by us. We are creatures of comfort rather than seekers of truth. We don't like things that upset us. We don't like things that challenge us. We don't like things that threaten us. And maybe that's okay, but that's just the way it is. But this may keep us from being honest and clear-sighted about the reality of the human condition. Number 3, why is Geborgenheit a profound illusion? Geborgenheit means security in German, apparently. I don't speak German. But it's an important idea. That is that as a creature of comfort, you want to feel secure. But ultimately, there is no security. There's no real security because of the constant possibility of death, because of the finitude of human existence. So the idea of an absolute security, as opposed to some kind of relative security that we're used to, is a profound illusion, because there is no security. And I think that quote from Heidegger about constant exposure to nothingness is the reason that he would regard a feeling of security as a profound illusion. Number 4, Jaspers regards death as one example of a, quote, boundary situation. What are the others mentioned, and what do they have in common? Well, he talks about things like guilt, chance, and suffering. What do they have in common? I would say what they have in common is that there's nothing you can do about them. That is, they're experiences where we reach a limit of our capacities. Let's take something like suffering. You are going to suffer. There is a certain amount of pain, both physical, emotional, psychological, that goes along with being alive. And you just have to endure it. Think about another one that he mentions, guilt. Guilt has to do with our feelings about what we have done in the past. And the past is irrevocable. So guilt is something that simply has to be endured, because there's nothing you can do about it. If you feel bad about something you've done in the past, you can't go back in time and change it. You simply have to accept the guilt. And chance, I mean, why did the rock hit you in the head and not the guy next to you? I mean, it's just something you need to accept. So boundary situation, like death, is where we reach the limit of sort of what we can do. I mean, we are ultimately helpless in the face of death. We can avoid it, which is Jonas's whole idea of being an organism, is constantly avoiding it. But ultimately, we will be defeated by it. According to Jaspers, what is it about death that we really fear? See page 120. If I'm correct in my memory of that, this is really where an existentialist diverges from Epicurus, because it's nothingness itself that we fear, which Epicurus would say that's ridiculous. Why would you fear becoming nothing? There's no suffering involved. Whereas for Jaspers, it is the becoming nothing itself which produces this experience of dread. So really, I guess you're down to first principles here, whether you're an existentialist or an Epicurean. Either the prospect of becoming nothing is something you're neutral about, or the prospect of becoming nothing is something that's absolutely terrifying. And number 6, what is the significance of the difference between realizing that all human beings die and realizing that I will die? That's an important distinction that Heidegger makes. If we just say that all human beings die, we've depersonalized it. We've saying, all men are mortal. But realizing in a sort of abstract way that you're part of a species that is mortal is much different from really registering that you personally will die. We all know that human beings die. But what they seem to be saying is that you have to have a much more personal, direct consciousness of your own death, and to really realize the truth of your situation. That to make it into an abstract thing is just a form of avoidance and denial. Number 7, why do existentialists reject the idea of death as fulfillment? I mean, you got me. It's a little bit vague, I think, the discussion of it, but it has to do with the existentialist idea that life has to be lived to the fullest at every moment. That life has to be meaningful at every moment. You can't sort of think of your life as leading up to something that will make it meaningful. It has to be meaningful now. So you shouldn't think of your death as some kind of story, that an end of a story where all the strands are pulled together. That's fiction. Death as fulfillment is another form of denial. The existentialist idea is that you have to make your life meaningful now. Number 8, what does it mean to live in the face of death? Well, it means to live in the truth, I think. We're all living in the face of death. It's just that some of us know it and some of us don't. And the ones who do know it are living in truth. And the ones who don't know it are living in some form of avoidance, in a haze. According to Heidegger's, number 9, according to Heidegger's idea about time, death, and being, why is it so important to be open towards death? Page 124. I know what I'm getting at there, but I'm not sure I'm going to find on page 124 exactly what I meant. You might find this in the videos. Let me just take a look. If you look down on page 124, the clarified, enlightened individual portrays being as it is to the extent that he exposes himself to the extreme openness, the most extreme openness there is, the openness towards death. Here, the existentialist's ultimate claim is plainly that the individual who lives in the face of death will not only gain insight into the truth of being, but he will be that truth. Well, the idea is that, I think, and here I would take a look at the clip from my dinner with Andre that I gave you, where Wallace Shawn provides a kind of an interpretation of this. And that is that you can't really be open to yourself, to reality and your own being, without also being open to death. That's the price you pay for living to the fullest. Being conscious of the reality of your situation entails being conscious of your own end, of your own death. So some form of awareness of death, awareness of your own inevitable death coming closer, a death consciousness, you might say, is a necessary part of being fully alive and being fully aware of one's situation. At least that was the idea I had in mind.